10 gallons of water up to boil very quickly. So I got a drop-in heating element, very much like what you might have in your water heater. And I decided not to go with a small one. I went with a 2,000 watt drop-in heater, which immediately said that I had to have a commercial controller. So I thought I bought a $100 extra heater that was going to need a $400 controller to work. But one of the advantages of belonging to 2 or 3 beer clubs, which I do belong to, is there's always people that have skill levels that I don't have. And an electrician actually built my controller for $60 worth of parts on Amazon. And it's probably the best piece of equipment I've ever gotten. So, and that's part of what happens here is, I don't think my wife understood what she started 9 years ago when I started this, but within about 3 or 4 years, I was basically trying to make beers to style. And I brought this in to remind me to tell you that basically 3 or 4, I think it's 6 years after I started, beer software is out there. So I put all my recipes around the computer. The biggest advantage is I can store recipes on the cloud. So when I go to my beer supply place and I want to get my ingredients, I just have to have my phone with me. And I can look up my ingredients on my phone, and I don't need to write notes or do any of that. And it also is my built-in timer. Any one of my devices can act as a brew timer. I just basically say, okay, I'm starting now. The timer starts and it tells me when to add things, and it keeps me on track. I don't know how many of you, but even when I barbecue at my house, I can't keep track of time. You know, you're going to put something on, it's going to be on there for 20 minutes. I automatically take my phone on and I set a timer. Because if I don't, I know what's going to happen. So the same thing happens with beer making. It's basically, but have all these tools and all these things that change, so this is new. I think the first time I heated water with this induction cooktop, then I read the instructions and it said that it was limited to 35 pounds in weight. And I had 7 gallons of water in it. So I had about 60 or 70 pounds on it. So I found, well, it didn't break, but then I also made these little furniture feet. And I learned about induction. Induction cooktop does not need to be in contact with the bottom of the pot. It can actually be elevated a little bit up and it'll still work. So little furniture feet for adjustment, got the pot off the top of the induction. So I call it my little Frankenstein system. It has to be plugged into two separate circuits in the house, because both of them draw 15 amps. I've discovered what it's like to blow the circuits out. So you have to figure out where it's going to get plugged in. But bottom line is there's not too many. I don't think you're going to see another electric brew system that's operating on 120 volts. Most of the time they do 240. So this is almost 4,000 watts worth of cooking power on 120 volts and 15 amps, which is ridiculous. You really wouldn't start from the get-go and build something like that. But it's kind of an indication of how brewers go too. Brewers are makers. I think I've met a lot of brewers that don't make very good beer, but they really like building things. So whatever it is they can build, whether it's a fermenter or a refrigerator with an external thermostat, whatever it is they get into the building of it. But I've always been more or less into the science and the art of what I'm doing. So I'm kind of like the Italian cook. I can change in midstream and decide, no, we're going to go a different direction. I'm the one who calls the shots. It's my beer. You know, and you're only doing it in 5 gallons, so you can be a lot more experimental with it too. So on this particular beer, I actually asked Stephen, I said, who would you talk to here on the North Coast that would basically be able to give me some advice on doing a Scottish wee heavy? Because I had never made one before. And I could look up recipes on Beersmith on my software. I can find them on the different magazines like Brew Your Own. You have all kinds of resources where you can find that. But the reality was I didn't really know what I was going to do. And he connected me with Jeff Newmeyer from Foggy Coast Brewers, and he was very opinionated in how I should do this. And the other part of doing this is basically you have to be willing to listen. This is a little darker beer, but this has no dark grains in it. Basically, this is doing something called the Maillard approach, Maillard reaction, where you actually take the first 2 or 3 gallons and you reduce it. It's what you do in cooking when you do a reduction sauce. So I took the beer and I basically boiled it down. The boiling it down created the color and also created the caramel tones. But my beer making friends are surprised that this is a single grain beer, and it's done with Golden Promise, which is a very light grain. So to see that color in there, so that's not possible. You had to do something else. And it was just basically from reduction, reducing the whole product. So I was real pleased with the way that it came out. And I basically, when we bottled it, I actually copied the Mendocino Brewing Company label. I could get in trouble, who knows? But since they're not around, it looks very much like it, yes.
Well, doesn't that eliminate the alcohol?
What's that?
Oh, the
Your
cooking
process.
The cooking?
Yeah.
No, that's pre-alcohol.
It's before you pitch the
pre-alcohol.
yeast.
Pre-alcohol, before you pitch yeast or anything else, so you reduce it. And obviously, when you reduce things, you lose volume. And when I'm only making 5 gallons to start with, I don't want to lose a lot of volume. Question?
By what volume, from what volume to what volume?
Well, a good example on this particular beer, 10 gallons of water. which
Okay.
Basically, this would be full. With 10 gallons of water, I got 4.5 gallons of beer
Okay,
out the back end.
okay,
You lose stuff, and you lose product at every step of the way.
sure.
So, but usually I'll get 5.5 out of a batch. And I'd like to do a little double IPAs. I'm very commonly doing 8% beers. This one's 10%. When you start pushing those kind of numbers, your efficiency goes way downhill. So, and this beer is going to be available. It's been available. It's available. Going to be available at auction at the Mushroom Festival. They call it. What do they call it again, Ann?
Our bars, bordellos, and mushrooms.
Bars, bordellos, and mushrooms.
They have a slightly different title, but our Kelly House Mushroom Participation event, Mushroom Festival Participation, November 3rd, yes.
So I'm normally
Get
not.
your tickets,
Right.
call Cindy.
It doesn't matter so much to me as winning prizes. It does getting the narrative back from judges, because when you submit beers to competitions, they use something called the BJCP standards, or Beer Judge Certification Program standards. They have the standards for every different style of beer. So they basically read the style of beer, what color should it be, how high in alcohol, everything for the parameters surrounding that beer, and that's the way that it's judged. So I was real happy to win this, because the bottom line is, since we're auctioning it, to me, a prize will mean that it'll auction for more money, hopefully. Yes?
I've been running around the office and not confessing that I don't know what wee heavy ale means. So I know I have a sense of ale, I know what heavy means, but the wee part? Are we talking real Scots? They're saying it's a wee heavy ale?
Yeah.
I
And
can't do a Scotch.
I think it's just a name, but to tell you the truth, even the prize that I won didn't fit into the Scottish ale category. Because the Scottish ale categories, by today's standards, are lower alcohol beers. So in order to enter it into an appropriate category, it had to be entered into an English strong ale category. Because the English beers went more to 10, 12%. So it's just a name. And Scottish wee heavies are known for being malt forward, which means the malt, it should be chewier to you. Caramel tone should be really strong, which is not what a lot of people are looking for nowadays in their beers. IPAs went that way probably about 10 years ago, and then got away from that real caramelly tone. But that's real specific to this particular style of beer. It also went through the whole process very much like the Frolic Ale would have. The Frolic Ale went from Scotland to Singapore, and basically I think it went there in kegs. And then once it got to Singapore, it was bottled in Singapore, and then the Frolic started its 7-week journey to here. So this sat on oak. It was sat on oak for about 2 months. It basically was bottled for 2 months before I served it. So it emulates the process it would have gone through and the time that it took to get over from Scotland. Yes,
What about doing an auction at the lighthouse?
that's an interesting
We
idea.
could use something like that.
That's an interesting idea. I was just amazed that they were open to doing this, because I got very excited about it, and I just thought, wow, this would be really neat. And then winning a prize and being able to maybe make this beer more valuable to the Kelly House.
That we're always
Totally
looking
in.
for fundraising.
There you go. So basically, does anybody else have any other questions about the making of this beer? Because I didn't want to take up all the time. Yeah.
Would you remind me how the Mendocino Brewing Company reimagined the original beer?
You know, I couldn't find.
Because I don't know the
I
details.
couldn't find any information at all on that.
I even looked too online, my experience doing that too. It's difficult to find, like little apps where you can go see what everybody's drinking and they're rating their beer. You can't find something like that. That was before all that, so it was kind of hard to track down any information on it at all, or why they did it, how much they made, Yeah.
And there's a chance in the future we might be able to, because my understanding is the Mendocino Brewing Company is coming back to life.
Really?
A gentleman that worked there initially and went to work for Lagunitas, said he loved the idea of the community brewery. He loved Mendocino Brewing Company. He's supposed to be coming back and supposed to be spearheading getting it reopened. So once it's reopened, I mean, he would be the guy to talk to because he would have been around at the time
Yeah,
that they
my
actually made
sense
this
is
beer.
they reimagined what was a typical medium weight beer in 1850.
Right.
But nobody brought, there's no report on it. And of course, the 6,100 bottles were destroyed, more or less,
Yeah.
in the crash or in the scuttling, so.
There was different things. The Scottish were late adopters of hops. So the Scottish basically used things like heather, and they used different natural products in place of hops. And I made the decision that since I couldn't get heather fresh, it was the best way to go. And I had heard that it had certain psychotropic qualities if it's not processed properly. I thought that probably wouldn't be the best thing to go with in this beer. Maybe the next one. Who knows? But we'll see.
Combining it with marijuana perhaps.
Well, and that's been done too.
And it's gaining popularity now too.
But Lagunitas made a beer that has supposedly marijuana or cannabis in it, but they use terpenes. They use the oils in it.
Oh,
And then they actually made a water that I believe I saw.
Mhm.
I saw it here
There's a
at
couple
the
people doing it
Harvest.
now.
They're making a water.
Eel
that's
River is doing a couple
some infused
alcoholic
water.
waters, yeah.
I just know that they're selling 4-packs of water for $7 or $8. It wasn't.
June's idea.
Yeah.
So no hops?
In this?
You didn't use any hops?
No, I did in this. It basically,
Which you-
and this was recommended for the style if they use either Hallertau or Fugels, so I used a Fugels because that's what I had available to me. It isn't really a hoppy beer, it's only a 25 IBU beer to start with, so.
You know, in the manifest for the Frolic, it's called Edinburgh's Ale.
Mhm.
And so this is just the Frolic, that's just another name, I assume.
And Edinburgh is where it came from in Scotland, I
Yeah.
used an Edinburgh ale yeast
Yeah.
to make this beer, so. As much as possible, I tried to stick with what would have really happened without really knowing. You know what I mean? Your idea of dropping it off in the ocean for a while was a brilliant one.
Yeah, I think so,
You
yeah.
know, if you've ever seen that show Brew Dogs, they've done crazy stuff like that. You know, we're gonna take this and we're gonna dump it off in the ocean, leave it there for a few months, and then go pick it up and see how it turns out. Yeah, I'm into that.
It'll just get stuck in that big blob of plastic.
Probably.
There you go.
It's good temperature control though, you know?
So now that you still have the yeast, you could do this again if you wanted
You
to?
know, a lot of people do that. They'll actually they'll harvest the yeast, so they reuse it. It can be reused and grown up to 10 times before it gets into weird little things that I've heard. But I don't harvest yeast because I make so many different styles of beer. My wife's not happy with me already for the one. They think it's one vegetable container that holds all of my hop pellets. She's not. So the idea of actually propagating the yeast and having yeast containers in the fridge that she can't identify would probably not be a good idea for me personally, so. Yes?
What's the process involved with kicking the alcohol content up to 10? Because when I was making home brew, I couldn't get more than about 6 out of my caramel malts.
I think part of the trick is a good healthy yeast starter.
Okay.
I mean, the reality here is I can take a standard package of yeast and it'd be 100 billion yeast cells.
Yeah.
If I put it with 6 ounces of extract in here,
Right.
I let it sit for a day, I have 300 billion yeast cells.
Okay.
It triples in that 1 day period of time. And then if I was really doing a larger quantity of a 10%, I'd do a step growth. I'd cold crash it, pour off the extra liquid, add more extract, do it again.
Okay.
Now you're taking 300 billion and you're turning it into.
You gotta keep feeding it, you gotta keep feeding the yeast,
Yeah.
otherwise they go dormant and will shut down, yeah,
Okay.
so.
And at the beginning stage, they're taking in oxygen and they're not really producing alcohol at that point. They're multiplying themselves.
Okay.
And then when they go in, I forget what they call it, anaerobic stage, there's a stage where it doesn't need oxygen, that's when it's actually producing alcohol. So
Right.
at this point, you leave it open, I just put aluminum foil over it, and it's basically growing it. And one of the byproducts is CO2. So if you see a foam on the top, then you know good things are happening. So,
Thank you.
Well, that being said, not all yeasts can handle an environment that's alcoholic too. I
Right.
mean,
That
so-
was
yeah.
the thing I remember that in order to make cider at one point in time, I had to get champagne yeast.
Yes.
Finish it,
Because
yeah,
it'll take
yeah.
a
sure.
higher
Yeah.
alcohol.
That's the secret, yep.
this was a combination of a stepped yeast starter, so it probably had 3 or 4 times as much yeast as it needed, and then oxygenated the heck out of it when it went into it, and that's a real key ingredient too. And I don't use straight oxygen, I just use an aquarium pump with a
Oh, do you just use that?
I just shoot it in there, and basically it's an aquarium pump with a 300 micron air stone on it, and put it down in there and blow as much as you possibly can into it, and that really gets the yeast started. My experience with fermentation on bigger alcohol beers is if they don't take off right away, they're never going to ferment out. There's just like no going back.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Original gravity was,
on this one, 1095, and it finished at 1024. A little on the sweet side, but I expected that. So
sweet.
yeah. Okay. I'd like to hear about overtime and Piaggi's, because I have lots of questions for you, Stephen.
Okay, that's great.
As long as it's not, how do I start a brewery?
Or a restaurant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that could go on forever. You know, so say, you know, you can make this great beer. I mean, and he's gotten into like realms of home brewing that I've never even thought about trying to delve into. He mentioned Jeff Newmeyer from in town here, who will go get a bottle of obscure Belgian whatever, drink the beer just to get to the yeast at the bottom, and then he will cultivate it like for months. And he'll have this pot of just, it looks like, even those things you find in the back of the fridge that have been there for a year, it looks like that, and he will make beer out of it. I mean, guys probably got the most yeast knowledge I've ever met, aside from maybe Fal Allen over at Anderson Valley. But started off in home brewing as well. My fascination with beer didn't really happen. I was kind of a wine guy. I grew up in Ohio, Michigan, and moved here from the East Coast and worked for all sorts of crazy people over there. But my thing was kind of wine, and all I knew about Mendocino was walking through Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village, and the dope guys are selling me, Mendocino buds or stuff like that. That's all I knew about Mendocino. But then I get into one of my celebrity chef guys that I was working for. He's got Lalanis, he's got Navarro, all these things are on the wine list, and we're selling them by the glass. And now I'm like, oh, there's wine out here in Mendocino County too. Well, years later, I end up out here and just moving out here, and still wasn't a beer guy, but had grown to like beer and appreciated it as a food product, like I think that wine is, and all the stuff that's grown out here. So I decided I wanted to make it after having an arrogant bastard. I'm like, I can make that. Or having a porter, I know how to make that. I want to know how to make the best stout that I can possibly do, because those are the things that I like. You play around, but then when you delve into the history that Mendocino County and Sonoma County had in resurrecting and keeping, I guess, the craft beer movement, if that's what you want to call it, alive, it's fascinating. I mean, there's books out that are fun reads that'll tell you. I mean, it's just right here. New Albion Brewery was only a short drive away, and that really was the first after Prohibition to kind of start back. Now, it didn't last for very long, but what it did was it created people like Ken Grossman and the Mendocino Brewing Company and those kind of places. It mentored those people, following along from Fritz Maytag with Anchorstein. It mentored those folks, and it created the first round of non-big three brewing guys after Prohibition. And if it wasn't for the willingful sharing of information, I mean, none of this would be here. So you
That's
learn
something
about
else to share too. I didn't share earlier is that I do have my recipe up here if you're interested. And you mentioned it's different. That's something that's always been different in the beer community. If you wanted to try to make Pliny the Elder, Vinny has made his recipe available to you.
You can. One of the first homebrew beers I did was Pliny the Elder.
Everybody in the homebrew industry in the brewing industry has always been very open. So, I mean, Cindy asked me, well, would you be willing to share this? Well, heck yeah, you can have my recipe.
That's the whole point.
That's really what it's all about. So,
breweries are about kind of at some level they're about community. You've got your you got your little town, you've got your church, you've got your jail, and you've got probably your brewery or maybe your distillery, and those are the pinnacles of any little outpost town. Kind of keep this going, but that sharing of information has been key. But so you've got a great couple recipes, and you think that you might want to try to make a go at this, especially with the explosion. I just read some numbers from 2017. I think there are 6,200 and something what they're calling craft breweries. I don't know what that size, you probably have to be under a certain size, but in the United States. You know, the year before there were only 5,000, so there's these things are opening up.
5 years ago, it was only
And
1,000.
5 years, you know, the bubble's going to burst, and it probably already is starting to sparkle out. San Diego has something like 370 breweries. Wrap your head around that. I don't know how many people live in San Diego, but holy smokes, man. You know, where do you choose to go to get a beer? I have no idea how they figure that out.
And there's already been a shrinking.
Oh yeah, very
Like
much so.
Stone let people go, and just recently Lagunitas let 100 people go
Absolutely,
in
yeah.
Sonoma County. Because they're based, when you get to a certain size, you have such a margin you have to hit, and if something's off just a certain percentage.
Well, at some point, that doesn't become a beer. That bottle of beer right there, it's not a bottle of beer, it's a unit. And it's not so much about how much it costs to make that unit, it's how much it costs to get that unit to Belgium or China or Maine. It becomes about that. And those are thoughts and things that I'll never have to worry about. But you know, that very much controls the price of that beer. And how do you get it on the shelf at Safeway or the Piggly Wiggly or wherever you might be? That's, you know, you've got to. That's money on levels that I just can't even. Those are zeros that I can't even fathom out there.
You're not growing overtime to this point. Right?
At that point, I can't see past.
You're not going to grow into a
I
production
can see
facility.
phase 3, but we're phase 1. We're heading into phase 2. I know what phase 3 is. After that, I have no idea what's supposed to happen. that's so much smarter than me. But so you know, you have great recipes and you think you have great feedback. Keep in mind that when you're having people over to have a party or you're tasting people on beer, 1, it's free. 2, there's alcohol in it, and 3, there's a good chance they're your friends or your family. So the feedback you might be getting might be slightly biased. You know, you really need to go to, like, before I moved out here from New York, you go to the farmers markets and you could taste their ciders and their wines, and you could actually start tasting beers out there before I came out here at the farmers markets. You could take a canister and fill them up out there. So you could take it, and they were doing that because they wanted the feedback. They wanted, you know, they didn't know who you were. They wanted your palate to get feedback, so they could go back then and figure out what they could do to make a better product, or is it a good product already, and should we start taking that next step? Feedback is very important about all that. Now, I partnered up with a few other knuckleheads and their significant others to get overtime going. But our brewmaster, whose name is Dave, and his right-hand man, Daniel, they'd been cultivating their recipes and a list of investors, which is a whole other element to opening up a brewery that I still don't even really have a great grasp on, for years. You know, they've been brewing since they were in high school. You know, okay, now they're still young. I'm in my 50s and they're in their 30s. So they've been doing it for quite a while, but they'd also created a following, and they would have a party, and then it was all about the feedback, so they could tweak the recipes. So my advice is, if you've got this great book of recipes and then you think you want to go open up a brewery, maybe make a business of it, is my first thought would be, don't do it. It's going to take 3 times as long as you think it's going to take to open, and it's going to take well over twice the money that you think it's going to need in order to just get the doors open. You know, let alone if you're going to put a restaurant in it. You know, just running a restaurant's a hard enough challenge all by itself. But you know, now you're taking 2 businesses that are similar in a lot of regards, but you're putting them together. Hopefully, one can shore up the other, especially out here where the times are cyclical and the people that come through the door. You know, putting both those things together or whatever, it can take some doing, and then you have to find people to actually work. Oh my gosh, you have to hire folks and put people to work, and you have to train them and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot going on in just having good recipes. You know, I give you a list. You know, you've got what we were talking about earlier. You've got marketing. How do you get your beer out there? You know, assuming that you decided you want to open a brewery and you've got a location and you think you've figured out what's going to happen. Now, we opened up in Fort Bragg, virtually baseball's throw away from a brewery that's been open for 30 plus years. You can get North Coast beer back in Ohio. The grocery store will let you walk around with beer that they serve on tap there while you're shopping. Of North Coast beer, Red Steel and Old Rasputin. I was stunned when I saw that. Okay, but they're all over in all the 50 states and in I don't know how many countries or whatever. Why would we do that? Well, the thought was maybe, you know, they don't fill growlers or do any canning or any specialty bottling. They do, you know, the 6-packs and all that kind of stuff, but they don't take the beer out of the tap and give it to you to go. There's a thought there. I knew that if we had a restaurant, depending on the direction that we decided the menu was going to take, we could probably do a little bit better job than they've been doing over the years. I've been here for 17 years, and they haven't necessarily had the greatest reputation. They've gone through a lot of good folks, and they've had at times made some really good food. But I knew that on a smaller level. Okay, so our pots aren't that small, but we're brewing 150 gallons at a time, which, you know, it's smaller than that case over there. You know, and we're filling up a 10-barrel fermenter on a good day. They have to brew twice in order to fill that thing all the way up before pitching yeast and fermenting it. The advantage of that over the tanks that North Coast might have in their thing, some of those things are 110 barrel. They're enormous. Is that we can make a better, maybe not necessarily a quality product, we can make a more interesting product, and we can do it more often, and we can change our mind basically daily. So looking at it from a small standpoint, what's the strength of a small company going up against a big company is? It's freshness, it's diversity, and our thought, not knocking anything that maybe North Coast is doing, because they're great community supporters, is we can also support our community both with jobs and revenue creation and all that, but we can get into those places that they just don't simply have time to do because they've gotten to a point that it's large. Their concern now is getting beer all the way over there, getting beer there. Well, we can kind of fill that void that's maybe just taken care of in our local community. That was something that we all felt strongly about. David and Daniel are both from here. Greg Zemer's been up here, who's one of our other partners and helped us open up the kitchen. He's been out here, I think, since the 80s. After he graduated the Culinary Institute, he moved over here and has been doing numerous things. But there's lots of things that do involved in a brewery. Has anybody ever negotiated a business lease? Has anybody ever had to go through a city council meeting just because you need a zoning variance because you want to serve hamburgers in a place that's zoned industrial? I mean, I've never done these things, never thought I would have to do these things. There's something you have to think about, you know. There's the whole legal side of things about incorporation, about labeling, what you have to do in order to sell beer at the door, how you have to train your staff in alcohol service. Oh, by the way, there's payroll. You know, you've got to tackle payroll, and when it's slow like it is right now, how you shrink payroll and keep that as low as you can while still trying to provide good quality products. You know, there's the licensing. Anybody ever talk to the state of California and the ABC or whatever? They're actually pretty easy to deal with, and they're all about issuing beer and wine licenses. But when I called them to ask them that, hey, I've got a couple small fermenters in the barn that we're not using, can I make cider? Because there's apples dropping off trees out here. Oh, no, you can't do that. That's not part of your brewing license. That's an agricultural product. You're forbidden from doing that. We'll shut you down if we find out you're making cider. No idea. You know, that's a different license altogether, and it has to be, that falls under a completely new set of guidelines, you know. If you want to keg your beer and you want to put it in outside accounts, there's distribution. Who's going to do that? How are you going to do that? If it becomes more of if it becomes over 50% of your business model, you then have to become a distributor, and you have to file and all this other kind of stuff. You know, shoot me in the head. I just want to load some stuff in the back truck and drop it off. You know? That's what I used to do with home brewing. You know, come on. There's hiring people. There's dealing with the health codes. It's interesting having the health department come in and go through the kitchen and the walk-in and behind the bar, whatever, and they look at the big beer tanks or whatever. They don't even go look at them. They don't even touch them. You know, they don't know what to do with them. It's kind of funny. You know, I guess that's more in the purview of the state of California. You know, there's accounting and just keeping up with that kind of thing. There's quality control. Okay, here's something. You know, you can make that beer, and you made this great beer once. Can you do it again? That's the hardest thing about brewing. It's great to be a home brewer. It's really difficult, you know, when you're making, let's just pick on one of the big guys, Budweiser, for a second. You know, that beer has to taste the same all the time because they've been doing this for decades. Well, you know, they do that. They make giant barrels. They blend it. They'll different batches are constantly trying to do that, but you're also doing it with agricultural products. You know, your grain, your hops, your yeast, depending on if it's been used once before or not. I mean, all those things change. The weather affects everything. If there's a drought in the plain states, all of a sudden grain prices are going to go up, and you got to get it from Canada or someplace else. You know, when these IPAs exploded, you know, you couldn't get hops to save your life because all these guys, all Sierra and all these guys are signing these giant contracts. So then if a little guy like us wanted to get some, let's just say Fuggles hops or whatever, something like that, you know, I had to, where I had to get those? I had to grow them myself, I guess.
And that was a whole different market too. Basically, when brewers, you buy hops futures.
Yeah.
They do.
You actually buy them 3 years in advance, and then one of the problems that came up was with a slight little reduction in craft brewers. Some said, "Oh, I'm going to buy so much for 3 years." They come back the next year and go, "You know, our production wasn't quite what we expected it to be, so we're not going to take all those hops that we wanted." Well, they based their production on that. So
Right.
who's holding the bag? It's actually the hop farmers.
It kind of
They're
is.
holding the bag, and they're actually subsidizing a lot of this. And you mentioned something like Budweiser. They produce 15 million gallons of beer out of that one facility in St. Louis. And my understanding is they actually propagate all their yeast that they use in all 11 plants in that one facility. And if you walk in there, you see something like this. It's really not that much different, but they basically control the quality of the yeast in one place, and then it gets shipped out to they use different water in every one of those facilities. Like the beer, hate the beer, the fact that they can turn out such a consistent product and turn out such quantity of it is really, really difficult
Really
to
hard.
do.
That's probably the hardest thing to do about it, you know. Aside from, it's as important as anything. If you're gonna have a product out there, it's as important as anything. It's just like keeping everything clean and sanitized, you know. But the consistency of product is everything. People, it's changing a little bit. People are very much, they want to have faith that Budweiser is going to be like Budweiser. They want to have trust that product. It's changing a little bit, almost mirroring the wine industry. You know, 1 year's harvest of that Pinot Noir, let's say, or that Gewürztraminer out of the Anderson Valley, can have a flavor profile, maybe you're in a city level or a residual sugar like this. The next year, it's probably going to be a little different. You know, different year, different weather, different whatever. You know, maybe whatever happened. You know, things change, and it's okay as long as they're making a good quality product. That's starting to happen in breweries now, especially some of the smaller ones. I first noticed it at Piaggi with some of these newer little guys coming out of Sacramento. Example would be maybe like, I'll pick on New Glory. They make great, fresh, bright IPAs. They're using some of that East Coast kind of more fruitiness rather than the piney bitterness that we kind of have on the West Coast out here. But they make all these great IPAs, and they're doing it consistently, but it's never the same. Every batch is different, and they're doing that. They don't want you to necessarily trust the beer, they want you to trust the brewery. And that is something that we kind of keyed into a little bit. Sure you want to have your staples. You know, we have our lightest ale, and by the way, Overtime only makes ales right now. We don't have any dedicated lagering tanks. We will, phase 3 in expansion, but we've got a lot of folks to start paying off before that happens. So we're just doing ales, but our lightest ale is what he calls a drinking beer. It's kind of a 6-row barley and wheat, kind of 50-50 blend. It's just a light, easy drinking thing. It is maybe scrimshaw-esque, but it's a different product completely. Nice, light, and easy. And he's making that, and he's got that recipe down in his little computer that's on the thing, that's like that. And depending on what kind of yeast he's able to get, you know, we don't cultivate our own yeast. It comes out pretty consistent because it's kind of a simple recipe, as a few of those beers are. And the things that he's trying to make the same all the time, once he's happy with the recipe, you got to kind of keep it simple, because on a small scale, we can't buy in bulk what we would need to do for a year, for 2 years, something like that. So when you look at people like Anderson Valley who have a machine in the middle of their brewery that's about the size of that cabinet over there, that's their yeast cultivator. And it's just this pot, and it's slowly churning, and it's temperature controlled, and every once in a while somebody has to go in there and has to feed it, and it's just totally. So whenever they're gonna pitch a beer, and they don't use it for everything, but they use it for about 90% of their beers, they control the quality. And yeast is just as important about putting flavors in your beer as just about anything else is, for that matter. But by controlling that and managing that, they're able to take that, not being able to get yeast out of the picture. Well, we're not there yet, so we have to call up White Labs or whomever Dave or Dan are getting yeast from, And if they don't have California #1, which is pretty standard IPA yeast, we've got to go with something else. Well, now all of a sudden you're looking at different products. So we've come to embrace maybe not having the same beers all the time, but we hope that at some point our reputation is as such as that it's just good quality beer. Now, you might not like the style, but there's probably a good chance that there'll be something out there that you'll drink. You know, in worst cases, we might have a hard cider or some sodas that we make on tap. Maybe we'll just keep you happy with something like that. But it's difficult. It's difficult to all these external factors and things like that. You know, it's just you have to have thick skin. I guess is probably one of the things you want to do. But again, you know, you're a great home brewer. You've got ribbons. You've got a staff behind you. You've got knowledge. Maybe you're the mad chemist like Jeff Newmeyer or something like that. You know, but brewing is the thing that I got off an article he sent to me was brewing's an activity, but beer's a business. Big difference. You know, brewing's it's festive. There's magic. There's the happy accident. There's the mad scientist. There's all these kind of great things. And at the end of the day, you might have access to something that drinks that may or may not have some alcohol in it. That's fantastic. But business is like, you know, if you don't have the business, you can't keep the doors open. And then you have to lay people off, and it's just challenges.
Some of the bigger breweries, probably 80% of the hops come out of Yakima, Washington. So when you talk about Russian River or Bear Republic, any of the bigger breweries that you can think of, they actually go up there at harvest time. And they go up there and they basically immerse themselves in the hops. They want not only that style of hop, they might pick only the hop from this particular field, because they're trying to get a hop that has the profile that is exactly the same as they've used before, so they can remake the beer. And they do breathe it. They'll take big piles of hops and they'll crush them and they'll smell them. And I don't know how these guys actually do this, and I know some people that are actually involved in that process, but to have that pressure of saying, okay, we got to make this beer and it needs to be the same next year and the year after that, that's a really, really difficult thing to do.
Yeah, so we just ignored that. Yeah.
I was going to ask about two things. One, timing. We know that time doesn't improve beer. What's the sense of which beers benefit from it?
Well, so I look at this a different way. I've been a comic book collector since I was a kid, and I don't think that I'm a hoarder, but I do have a substantial collection of beer bottles up above Piaggi, which is where my office is, but it's more just storage. But you know, I'm the first one to admit that I'll hold on to things longer than I probably should. So when you're thinking about aging, think of it like wine. I mean, it's a living thing in there, you know, and it's got alcohol in it. It can be acidic. It's not so much, in my experience, the temperature that you're holding something at. It's the fluctuation in temperature that can do damage. You know, light cannot be good. We all kind of know that. That's why beer bottles are brown or green or in boxes or whatnot.
Time
you know.
can help as well as injure?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Time can help in the sense of...
I think so. It changes things. I've got, you know, when I moved back out to California, I brought 40 cases of California wine back out here. It's funny, it's a big joke. I've been collecting wine again. I tend to collect some things. You know, you open up a 40-year-old bottle of, let's say, William Hill, a Cabernet from Napa Valley, whatever, it's pretty good. As long as it's been stored right and the cork stayed in and didn't get oxidized inside there, it's seriously good. Now, is it going to be different? It'd be nice to have enough to taste every 5 years and see the change on it. A beer can go like that. Maybe not live as long, but you know, hey, we tried a 30-some-year-old bottle of, you know, beer that was pretty fantastic. You know, I look at things being bigger, fuller, higher gravity, you know, stronger alcohol, maybe more substance in it, like a big black stout. I opened up about a year ago at Piaggi, Stone Russian Imperial Stout. It's the only stout I really like better than North Coast Imperial Russian Stout. And the only reason I like it is because it can get a little blueberry, blackberry fruit to go along with that bitterness and that chewiness that comes with it. And we opened up one that was 9 years old. Might be right up there with the top 2 or 3 beers I've ever had. It was fantastic, you know. And it was just held on. It was stuck in a box. It wasn't even held sideways. Just stuck in a box in the back. Forgot about it. Moving something underneath the desk. Oh, that's there. Let's try it. And it was absolutely wonderful. Now, that being said, you know, here's also the clicker. You know, you wanna open up a brewery or whatever. Okay, today that might taste great. You know, tomorrow maybe you're getting a cold or maybe it's raining out or whatever, your palate's different every day. Your palate changes minute by minute, especially if you're eating with something like that, it changes. It might change with the company that you're sitting at the dinner table, all that kind of stuff. Every day is a different day, so it's also a subjective thing as to whether or not you think it tastes good or not. Throw that in the mix, and that's something else to think about too. But, they put hops in beer because some doctor back in England in 1870 or whatever figured out that hops act as a sedative. They also act as a stabilizer, and the hoppier the beer is, the longer that voyage over the ocean to India to feed the troops can be. There's your IPA. So more hops equals more stability equals longevity in beer. So hoppier, bigger, badder beers, and they're making crazily hot beers. They can last. I used to have a poker game at my house, and somebody brought over a growler of Pliny the Elder. Okay, well, there was already beer and wine out, and it just got put in the back fridge, which is kind of the beer, and that's where I keep all my hops and everything else too. And it got put back in there. Well, I didn't see it for 2.5 years. It's in the ground. Now, it wasn't opened. It had been filled and shut and put in there or whatever, and we opened it up. Fantastic. Completely sparkled and just chewy and hoppy and everything that you would want a Pliny the Elder to be. So it can. Now, is a nice light lager or something like that going to last a couple years in a can in the fridge? It might, but it might start turning on you and might get something like that. So
And we're learning more and more too all the time. You have to remember back when they originally, 2,000 years ago, were making beer, they didn't even know what yeast was.
Right.
You just dumped the beer in a kettle, left it outside, and it started growing stuff on top of it. And they go, wow, that's cool. They're picking up wild yeast, and now here we are this many years later, and that's a big trend, doing those wild yeast beers.
Bread makers
Anchor
have been
Steam,
making bread
Anchor
that way the
Steam,
whole
that's the
time.
way they
Yeah.
do their beer. They're on the 3rd floor of the building. It's all open vats. And they basically just pour the beer in the open vats, and it ferments from natural ingredients that it picks up. But you mentioned aging. There's a company in Chicago called Goose Island. They make Bourbon County stouts, and they've been really highly touted as one of the better ones. But there'll be groups of people that'll have the 2013, 14, 15. They'll get 5 different years of Bourbon County stout, and they'll open them together and say, did it really benefit from this extra year of aging? This recipe was a little bit better. I liked this one before, but now I don't like. You could drive yourself crazy.
Time being only one of many variables, is what you're
Yes.
saying. And
Yes.
the other question I had to do with what I learned from a British friend who removed half of the carbonation from most of the bottled beer that came from England. And his thesis was that the change of temperature of shipping, especially the extremes of cold and hot, obliged those brewers to put in more carbonation. Because when when we're in the UK, those beers coming out of the basement are much less carbonated.
That's right, yeah.
And so what I'm now doing with certain beers is I'm essentially spooning out half of the carbonation
Okay.
till I get to, because I think it cuts into the flavor.
Or decant it.
And the smoother, or decant, in effect, instantly. And so I wondered if that was true, that the shipping, the cold to hot temperatures oblige them
That can
to
be
overdo the
damaged.
carbonation.
Yeah, no, as far as affecting the carbonation, sure, I would imagine as things warm up, they're want to release their gases more out of the thing, but in a sealed vessel, I'm not sure quite how that I don't know enough of the science about that as
I
to how
wasn't
that's
either,
going
that's why I'm asking.
In fact, I do know that, in that part of Europe, they're not exactly drinking big fizzy beers. And if you go to Germany, there tends to be a little more carbonation in there, but they're also doing a lot more lagers, whereas the English tend to be doing a little more ales. But they tend to like that bit more of a carbonation as far as shipping is concerned, and with that, it's quite possible.
One of the things they discovered is when you started using hops, and everybody thinks of India pale ales, where they actually used to put them on ship and ship them to India. And they started hopping up the beers because hops is a preservative, so they found they could preserve the beer across its ocean voyage. What they didn't take into account, and basically what they do, they take barrels of beer over to India, and then once they empty the barrels, they take the barrels apart and ship the staves back, and then reassemble them and use the same barrels. It was just a cost savings measure. Okay, what they didn't realize is that the yeast can actually embed itself up to 3/4 of an inch into the oak. And so when you think about it, they're reusing these, it wasn't just the hops. It was going through another fermentation. It's on a ship, it's being agitated, it's got yeast in there, and so actually the India Pale Ales got to be so popular were basically fermented an additional time. It wasn't just the use of hops. So you start thinking about recreating traditional recipes. Maybe you think about doing that too. It's crazy.
So,
Name of your company, your brew company.
well,
Here.
yeah, the brewery is called Overtime Brewing Company.
Yeah, where did that come from?
It came out of David, and I think he and Dano, and maybe Dave's wife Carrie had spoken about it, because we knew if this was something that was going to go forward and actually happen, it would be done in overtime. We knew we were all. I mean, I've had Piachi for heading into 16 years. We knew we weren't going to quit our jobs and go work at the brewery because we weren't getting paid anytime soon. We knew we were going to have to be doing this in our spare time, in our overtime, and that's where the name came from. And from my side of things, the name Overtime, if we were to start having some fun and with naming of the beers or getting beers out there, whatever, there's a lot of fun play on the words, and from a marketing perspective, it's a good name because you can double time, time and a half. You could have a lot of fun with things like that. So the name did come from the brewer because he was very aware that he wasn't leaving his machinist job anytime soon. You know, just because he'd come over here and play in the tanks and make beer. Yes, ma'am.
I have a history question I'm ashamed to ask, but I never got to find out. The hops, you mentioned Yakima Valley and the hops up there. The hops here in Mendocino County, around Hopland, I assume. All those folks that were picking those hops, was the market San Francisco?
I'm not so sure about that. It could quite possibly. I mean, there were probably little breweries. I mean, I just found out that there was a little brewery here in town, just up Lansing
So
Street.
some for local, I imagine, but
I would imagine probably because are they going to put a bunch of hop bales on a cart or I suppose there were probably trains back then and ship them east? Possible. But the East Coast could get their hops much easily from Europe at that time. It's closer. It was just closer. That part of the country was just closer on the East Coast. So I'm not exactly sure.
There were three major breweries in Santa Rosa that took a lot of the hops.
There you go.
When I was growing up, the Russian River Valley near Jimtown on Highway 128,
Right, yeah.
huge hop fields. I distinctly remember those as a kid driving past there. There were acres and acres, literally hundreds of acres of hops in there.
And that's what you need.
And that was all going to Grace Brothers in Santa Rosa.
And I know the Windsor Historical Society basically actually harvested hops rhizomes from the banks of the Russian River, and they're actually growing them at the museum. So once a year they have picking where you go over. They don't even know what kind of hops they are.
No,
They
I'm
just
sure
basically
that they came from those hop fields because the river did flood.
Mhm.
I remember the 54 and 64 floods, and those hop fields were very definitely under a lot of water, and I'm
that's-
sure that a lot of
And
that
that's
stuff
even
washed
started
out.
a new trend with home brewing and something like what I do in such a small scale, that I don't need an awful lot of product to be able to do it.
Right.
And they're moving more and more towards what they refer to as terroir product. There's no reason why wine has to say that our grapes are better because they grow on that side of that hill. We could basically do a terroir beer that has to do with hops that were grown in this local area.
Right.
I can harvest wild yeast. I can actually pull yeast out of the area. The only thing we really don't have access to is localized grain, although there is some place in Healdsburg, a bakery that's even doing that. And then you can make a beer that's from this area. It is here, it is local, it is very specialized. And they're doing a lot of wet hop beers too.
Sure they are.
At harvest time, and then Vinny at Russian Rivers trying to get as much as he possibly can at harvest time so he can make these wet hop beers.
It's difficult, I would think. I was trying to find out why. I mean, you can grow hops anywhere you can grow a rose, pretty much. I mean, I grow hops in my yard. I grow them on the south side of the house, which is all windows, so that in summertime, it's got a nice screen, it's pretty. If I feel like I'm making a beer, I can do a fresh hop beer right there, and their Fuggles hops are great hops. But the problem is, as I understand it, is, they were dug up and taken out to put in orchards, and then the grapes and everything took over, and so it's all yield per acre, is really what it kind of comes down to. And hops while they don't need a lot of water, they need some water every day, and they need soil that can drain really well every day. But you also need square footage. You need a lot of hops to make, 5 gallons of beer. Yeah, well, not you need 6 ounces of hops to make 5 gallons of beer or something like that, So you need a lot of acreage in order to really, kind of do a lot of
And you're
things.
fresh, the equation to actual hops, it's 80% liquid. So like I grow hops in Windsor and I grow hops up here, and I do something called a hop cage, where it's basically the hops rhizomes will start to flower once they reach 20 feet. That's why you usually see them up very high. So you get a controlled cage and you make them go back and forth. So when they reach 20 feet with the growth, they'll start to bloom. Well, I got a pound of hops. Sounds like a lot of hops. But dried, that's 16 ounces times 2, that's 3.2 ounces of dried hops. I have enough hops to do one beer. One beer. So.
That's about the way I look at it. I asked Dave, you know, 'cause I have a couple barrels in the back fenced-in garden, and I got a row up front, and I'm like, I'll probably get about 2 pounds of hops out of this maybe. He's like, it's not enough, you know, we need more beer, you know. So it's just like, you have to think about it that way. But yeah, they just got ripped out and planted by something that makes more money
And
for
then
the folks growing it.
once we find something like at a home brewer level that we really like and successful with, guaranteed the commercial brewers are going to get a hold of it. And the next thing you know, the product's not available. A good example is I've been trying to make the best IPA recipe for the entire time I've been making. I love IPAs, and I got my hands on something called hop hash.
Mhm.
And my understanding is what it is when they pelletize the hops and they drive them through the machine, it makes rabbit pellets, because it gets all gunked up because of the oils and everything else. They scrape that out to clean out the machine. Well, what they found was that stuff they scraped out is like six times the alpha acid
awesome,
level,
yeah.
and it has none of the vegetable material in it, so you have no vegetable taste in it. I can make a 90 IBU beer with 2 ounces of hops. It was awesome, and it was delicious. Can I get it now?
It's hard.
Suddenly within 1 year period of time, and then we have a new harvest coming up. Well, it'll be interesting to see if I can even get my
I'm
hands
not
on
sure
it.
what drove what, but the marijuana industry and all their oils and hashes and keefs and all those kind of things, those products, I don't know if the hop industry kind of was doing it first, or I think the hops are probably chasing behind those guys,
They are.
because they're related products. I mean, they're very similar in flavor profiles, actually.
We have hop shots. You have actually
Yeah,
syringes with
it's
oils.
just,
and
they're
then-
getting smarter about it. Hops, another reason that you might see an apple orchard or a grape orchard is that you're not just getting apples and selling them at the store or making juice and pressing them and making juice. There's a lot of different avenues to get rid of your apples, you know. Whereas hops, you pretty much have your harvest. You've got fresh hops, which is now becoming more popular, but then you dry the hops and you get rid of them, and that's it. If you don't get rid of them, you're stuck with them. What do you do with it? You know, well, now they were pelletizing them, making them cold, that we could then keep refrigerated so we can make beer all year round. But that's always kind of been it. But now with these oils and these powders and different techniques, they're starting to get back up there. Is Hopland ever going to grow hops again? It would be neat, but
They even
probably
have
not.
cryo hops now. So they basically use the nitrogen and actually freeze them and separate out the vegetable material from the oils and everything
Have you
else.
found any suppliers for Slough House, California? There's supposedly still hops being grown over there.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if my partners have looked into that or not. I'll have to check that out.
I know Lake County's kind of taken off. I can't think of the name.
See,
of the
we've made some
company.
calls about that to try to get some stuff, but
Yeah.
there's also some breweries out there that are also on the list there
Well, I
too.
was
So.
looking for sources of hop plants,
Mm-hmm.
and this place, Slough House, which is east of Sacramento, somewhere over in there.
Slaughterhouse.
No, Slough House.
So you're looking for rhizomes?
At the time I was.
Yeah.
I ended up getting hop rhizomes, which I not cultivated, they're still alive at benign neglect. 40 years ago from Humboldt County of all places.
Right, sure.
And they came out of an abandoned gold mining town. So, you know, somebody up there was making beer because there wouldn't have been hops growing wild out in the middle of the, you know,
Of course.
Alps up there, just, there they were.
Sierra Nevada, I don't remember the time, it's 7, I'm just gonna say 7, 8 years ago, released, they do the little beer camps, and they had, in association with that, they gave Piachi a couple 5-gallon kegs, and they were this hop that was discovered in New Mexico, growing up the side of a ravine. The strange thing about it was this hop head, the cone head, started out one, but then it split into 2, and they all did that. And they had no idea, what it was, but they knew it was a hop, and it had, the lupulin powder and everything in it. So Sierra Nevada bought all they could, and they made a beer out of it. awesome. Don't know what the hop was called, but it was just on the side of a thing in the desert. I mean, how
There's
does that happen?
one farm in Yakima, they basically had a hop that was growing over the processing building. And it was just basically growing wild, and they noticed, the employees noticed when we went past it, it smelled like strawberries. And they never picked up that aroma. So they basically started harvesting it, call it Belma. And it is the most unusual aromatic hop that I've ever used. But again, I really like it. So chances are other people will. And then the next year it won't be available to home brewers, it'll be snatched up by commercial.
You know,
So,
there used to be wild hops when you start off from Cloverdale onto 128, and you go by the old hop processing plant there. There used to be
You'd see them
wild
growing up
hops
there,
on the
yeah.
right there for years.
I'm surprised that they weren't still struggling along. They're pretty hardy, you know, unless they get stuck in soggy ground. They're pretty
there's
pretty hard
actually
to
a hop
kill.
growing alliance that's formed in Sonoma County, and I didn't think it had much of a chance. 7 growers that have kind of gone in together, and I didn't think it had much of a chance of being really a viable business because their volume, they could never produce enough. But they actually found enough money to buy a harvesting machine, so they're kind of committed to making it happen. So
Some of these hop guys I've noticed. I asked Dave what his favorite hop combination or whatever it was in making beer that he liked, and he's like, there's something called Falconer's Flight. It's this guy up in Washington. It's great. It's a hop grower. He blends. It's a blend of like 7 or 9 different hop varieties he puts together, and he patented it. So you can only get it from him.
yeah.
So there's a way to keep your hop farm going, is to make that custom blend that everybody likes. And,
that happens periodically. They have
you know, you'll find that.
They have Columbus, they call Columbus CTZ. It's a
Yeah.
very well-known hop for bittering. It's Columbus, Tomahawk, and Zeus. It's 3 different hops that are kind of blended together to make this super hop, if you will.
Yep. So it's interesting. But yeah, it's,
I'm sorry, where was the brewery here in Mendocino?
Well, there was Brewery Gulch,
Brewery
and then
Gulch.
there was Pacific Grove Brewery right across from the Point Cabrillo Museum,
Right.
the Point Cabrillo
We
Lighthouse.
found any evidence that there actually
Grove.
was a brewery at Brewery Gulch?
Pine Grove, going to Russian,
Well, that's what she was talking
What's
about.
that?
okay,
Pine Grove.
Pine Grove, okay.
Yeah.
lots of breweries. People like their beer.
So you mentioned that Overtime has, I forget, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3.
Phase 1 was getting the damn doors open.
Yeah.
That was just about 3.5 years to the day of signing a lease. Well, let me back that up. That was 3 years to the day of signing a lease. On June 1st, we opened up. Happened to be our first Friday. My recommendation, if you are going to open up a restaurant or any kind of thing like that, don't do it on a first Friday in Fort Bragg. That was insane. But been talking about it. We had seen the space became available. It was the old paper making gallery.
Tire shop in my day.
Well, yeah, tire. It's still we still pay our rent to the Fort Bragg Tire. Gary owns it. They live over. The family lives over in Willits.
She's gonna try to slow you down.
Oh, that's totally fine. I'm done.
I'd like to really thank Drew and Stephen for coming out today and doing the Sunday afternoon with all of us. I'd also like to thank all of you for your attendance today. That's it.
Okay, now could you tell us about phase 3? I know you know.
Phase 3, that's okay.
Phase 2
I know, no, but he did.
Phase 1 was just getting open.
Yeah.
Phase 2 is basically just growing the business and a demand for the product. And with Overtime, in
Yes.
my mind, now if you're talking to the brewer, it might not be his mind as well, but in my mind, it was making a kitchen that's as strong as the 2 brewers are. Well, it's not just the 2 brewers, there's a couple other guys that help out. But I wanted, if we're going to serve food, the food better be as good as the beer and vice versa. They've got to play off each other. And in a town where we're just trying to support the community and that's very seasonal with its traffic, it was important to get people to come there to eat as much as it was to come maybe have a beer and then take a can to go home with you. That was phase 2. Phase 2 also incorporated, in December, we've been open, in December we'll be open 6 months, and we have to start paying back our investors, which was a sizable chunk of money by the time. So we had to get the doors open, see what you can lay all these great plans down, as to how you think your restaurant or your business is going to operate. But once you open the doors, you better be able to react on the fly. See how the space kind of dictates flows and all that kind of stuff. So getting open, getting money coming in, getting staff, getting comfortable with recipes in the kitchen, growing the business, putting enough money away so we can start figuring out our payment schedule so that we can then figure out, well, how are we going to get through a winter? We knew we were open in June. We would have liked to have been open in the spring, but we just didn't get our federal license until April, which means we couldn't begin testing beer batches on the bigger scale system that we had until we had our federal permit. And that had taken longer than anything. When, I can't remember which Bush, when Bush #2 was in office, less government is more, right? There used to be a federal licensing office in almost every town that there was a California ABC office. Okay, our closest one is in Santa Rosa. Well, when Mr. Bush was president, closing on the government, he closed it down to like 3 facilities, and our closest federal licensing place was in Cincinnati. So just back and forth and back and forth, back and forth. And then it took a while, so we couldn't even practice until April. So once that started, they were kicking it out, they were breaking stuff, screwing it up, burning out elements like he has inside his tank and all that. And then finally, we had 4 beers when we opened. I think we had 5 beers when we opened the door. Phase 3 is going to be out there and wholesale distribution, and figuring out how not just take care of maybe say Fort Bragg and Mendocino, but how to take care of our part of the county, and have a couple, have a spot, have a wholesale account in let's say like Laytonville, have one down here in Mendocino, have one down at the pier in Point Arena, and just boom, 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 so that they will then. Our goal is to get them to come to Fort Bragg, enjoy the bike ride on the trail. Check out the restaurant, stay in a hotel, bed and breakfast, come down here, look at the awesome beach, come to the brewery, get some beer, take some with you, and people are, as much as wine tours are popular, people are doing beer tours now, and have been for some time. And we knew that Fort Bragg was already on the map with that because of the North Coast Brewing Company being there, and we just wanted to capitalize on it and be the little new upstart in there to do that. So phase 3 kind of involves growing that brand. Phase 3 is also going to probably have to involve expansion of tank size. If our beginning opening is any indication of what being open in the summer a year from now, with word of mouth and more people finding us and all that stuff, we haven't done any advertising because we don't have any money to do that. If we're going to be that busy, the 12 beers that we currently have on tap today probably shrink down to about 6 with the current size fermentation tanks that we have. So if you brewery and you want to make more money, you need bigger tanks. That's always been the rule of thumb on there. So we need to get some bigger tanks to replace some of these small 5-barrel tanks. And that's part of
Room for bigger tanks?
What's that?
You have room for bigger?
Well, the beauty of the space that we rented was that the ceilings were 18 feet tall. So the 10-barrel tanks, can we get much bigger than those? No, but we have 6 5-barrel tanks that could grow up and do that. And then if you notice, if you're familiar with the space on the Franklin Street side, there's a big red barn. And Gary and his family kind of have half of their stuff that we hang on to in there, and we use the other half to store our beer and equipment that we use on brew days. So we can expand into there, but again, that means we need to have a glycol system out there. We got to rewire the whole thing. We got to secure the whole thing. We got to have the health department come out there. I mean, it's just more money. I mean, it's all about money, So I'm in no hurry to get to that spot and expanding into there, but get as close as we can get the day-to-day operations of the actual tap house to be profitable. I'll feel very comfortable when we get there, and we're able to pay off our investors. And at some point, maybe I'll get a paycheck. That's phase 3.
Okay, that's it.
Okay.
Say bye.
Thank you both.